Media is dead. Long live media. Yes. I mean, this article does have a fairly good point, as it summarizes an interesting little change in our current day media scene that we did touch upon during last week's ArchCast as well, in relation to the Joe Rogan and Donald Trump podcast, which was probably the single biggest media event of this election, short of Trump getting shot, I suppose. As they talk about here how big media is over, which is largely true, and this is a transitionary phase that will happen to anything and everything. Big media is being replaced by smaller, independent creators that are offering something new, an authenticity that Fox News can no longer offer, and eventually that authenticity too will become a manufactured form of authenticity. Eventually it's like, reality TV shows will largely be scripted and highly produced, and so in return it too will begin to fall off slowly but surely, and eventually be replaced as well. Now, personally, I think we're all basically going to get replaced by AI at some point. Apparently, I am absolutely convinced that the replacement to YouTubers will not be new media conglomerates. There will be a bit of a medium in the middle thing as some of the larger YouTubers age out and begin their own media conglomerates in essence in the form of multi-channel networks, but they won't be the television stations of old, at least not as far as I'm concerned, or in my opinion. Rather, you will log on to a site with your idea, because by then, any hint of internet anonymity will have long since been eradicated. I'm honestly kind of surprised it's lasted as long as it has. Where instead of then watching a live stream, you will pick a personality, whether it be news, politics, gaming, etc., and they'll simply just be there one-on-one with you, providing whatever experience you wish to have at the time, be it an old-school live stream format, or a more personalized conversation, or playing games together, etc. But we've wandered somewhat off the point immediately. The mainstream media's dominance in narrative and reality shaping in the president's election shattered in 2024. I would actually say that it probably shattered earlier than that. I think it actually broke in 2016, where memes and internet culture carried Donald Trump to the White House. That was the moment that media actually essentially died. And it has simply just been continuing to die very slowly for a very long time since then. The future of news and information is upon us. Welcome to the Shards of Glass election and news era. Now, the framing there is not incorrect, but it's also very clearly alarmist. It is like, oh, the shards of glass. The big picture will be shattered and be diluted by 1,000 points of views. And that is actually kind of correct. But I don't think that they are going to be, shards of glass, as in jagged, sharp objects. If anything, I believe it's going to bring things into far more focus than previously. As if you have 1,000 YouTubers all covering the same story, you're likely to have 900 relatively similar takes, but also likely to have some unique ones in there as well, that choose to illuminate specific portions of a news story over others. And what they focus on might even be a point of preference, like somebody will prefer to have a conservative opinion on that, or a liberal opinion on this, etc., and so on and so on. How and where Americans get informed has broken into scores of pieces, from young men on Joe Rogan's podcast to suburban women following Instagram influencers. Both campaigns have targeted a small, often little appreciated charge to reach hyper-specific pockets of potential voters, like when Bernie Sanders was streaming with a Catboy VTuber recently. That is indeed a hyper-specific pocket of voter, and more even so than the hyper-specific packet of voters as well, I believe they're doing this for general influence here, because again, there just aren't that many people watching the old-school media anymore. If you want to look for a younger demographic, you're not going to find them on Fox News. You are, however, going to find them on 1,000 different smaller podcast channels. So it isn't about targeting that group specifically so much as casting the widest net possible, which is why you now see politicians pretending to enjoy video games, for example. Former President Trump reached way more potential male voters with his 3-hour Rogan conversation, 33 million views over the weekend, than he could have done with a dozen or more appearances on Fox News. And rather than just male voters as well, young male voters. There's the important one. Joe Rogan's audience is probably going to be in like the 20 to 30 bracket, I'd argue, whereas mainstream media is probably leaning closer to, 40s, 50s, or even 60s at this point. On Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC combined, all three cable news networks skew very old in viewership. There you go, 67 to 70. I was being overly optimistic. Vice President Kamala Harris reached more young women on Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy, help me, podcast show about sex and relationship than she could on CBS 60 Minutes and ABC's The View combined. Both shows skews very old too. And there is an additional bonus to this as well. See, media has an interesting reputation that contrasts rather starkly with the reality of media. Like 60 Minutes, for example. 60 Minutes has a bit of a reputation, at least in olden days, of being a bit more hard-hitting journalism, of being a bit more serious, where you got a 60-minute conversation with someone, a politician or a piece of information or an article, etc. And so they were given an hour to go in depth, to hammer the person, to ask some pressing questions. It was kind of a promise of a more honest sort of interview, producing a more honest sort of politician or a more honest look into something. But Kamala Harris's interview was famously 23 minutes? 21 minutes with Fox News? Because these are no longer interviews, they are PR performances, where even on a very hostile platforms like Fox News with Kamala Harris or MSNBC from Trump, they still attempt to maintain a degree of decorum, kind of. Like, they understand that if they don't abide by a minimum standard of, behavior, I guess, then they simply will not get access to the candidate anymore, and they will cut themselves off from what they perceive to be a very important news point, right? It's kind of the same like access media and PC gaming as well. Many of the mainstream gaming outlets get their review codes primarily due to the fact that they will give good reviews. Or the recent Dragon Age Veilguard controversy, where a bunch of the streamers who had been more controversial and opinionated about the lacking quality of the product did not receive review codes, whereas other people who simply said that they presented as transgender or female, etc., feminine presenting, were given review codes seemingly solely based on their, quote, sexuality. Now, in part, this is also because Dragon Age Veilguard is aimed at a very specific audience, and they probably figured that a day them would give them a far more positive sort of coverage than your average he or she, but even so, this then comes into the real problem here, right? That back in the day, and I remember this was a topic that Total Biscuit covered before he passed on. God, I miss Total Biscuit. Anywho, Total Biscuit was like the name in video game reviews. He was probably one of the most popular and one of the ones who were viewed as having the most integrity. When Total Biscuit said that he liked something, you were fairly certain that it had a great deal of thought put in behind it, right? It was a well thought out opinion, and there was probably a really good reason why he actually liked it. This gave him a lot of consumer trust. Now, a lot of companies then thought to themselves, okay, well, if we get Total Biscuit on side, we'll see a massive increase in sales. And yes, they often would. But there are wild cards there, where the companies would then begin looking at, but if he gives us a bad review, well then we'll lose lots of sales. Holy shit. Where the companies would then begin to kind of calculate out and rank the reviewers. Like, some reviewers were reliable because, they were either just nice people who didn't like to say ill things about the game due to format or personality, or they were unreliable, as in they might bash a game for fun, or they were wild cards. The wild cards were usually the actual reviewers. Total Biscuit was very much so in that particular camp. And in many cases then, the video game companies would decide that, okay, instead of sending out a review key to this guy that we don't know if he's gonna give us a good review, and he might get like 200,000 views on a video, instead, let's send out 250,000 review keys, in essence, to 250,000 smaller viewers, to smaller streamers. And of course, it wouldn't be like that. It would be more like, 5,000 keys or something. The smaller guys would then get a few thousand views each, but you get the general idea. It was far more predictably effective for these companies to give out keys to people they knew would be grateful even just for the attention and be like, oh my god, a review key, wow, than sending it out to one guy with a big platform that might simply just hate on you and cost you sales instead. That's kind of what's happening here, where Donald Trump knows that Joe Rogan, he can probably have a nice conversation with him and gush about UFC fighting, and Kamala Harris probably knows that she's not going to be able to do quite as well. She doesn't have the ability to just waffle off on a 3-hour rant like Donald Trump does. She's not as good as thinking on her feet. Meanwhile, she can go on a Call Her Daddy podcast, and I don't know why I'm presuming this, because I know very little about the Call Her Daddy podcast. But for some reason, I have a sneaking suspicion that they might lean a bit more liberal, and might therefore be quite happy to have Kamala Harris on. And again, it's also just the star power, like, wow, a presidential candidate on Twitch, like, wow, etc. It will allow presidential candidates, in essence, to shop around for preferential treatment across 1,000 platforms that might together be vastly more important than Fox News or CNN or whatever. And this is both good in that it might actually provide a more personal take on the politics, and it is also bad because, well, now you are literally shopping around for the most preferential coverage. And depending upon who you pick and their reach, etc., you can go on one Joe Rogan podcast or 10 smaller podcasts and so on. Memes, prediction marks, and long-form podcast interviews shape the conversation as surely as any front page, far more so, I'd say. This new fragmented reality is the future, not just elections, but also for how America learns about business, product, technology, culture, and current events. It's how reality will be shaped and truths heard. It is where partisans will sharpen and spread their ideas, or lies. It is where trends and misinformation will be born and trafficked. It is where products and brands will be judged and sold. It is where a new generation of information stars are spawned. Now, all of this is in part true, because yes, there are lies on the internet as well. There are absolutely YouTubers who either pick up a story and then run with it before having any sort of confirmation, who doesn't mention that clearly enough, or who will simply go with rumors that are even, I am 98% sure I have seen people like that, who simply make shit up out of whole cloth because they believe it will get them clicks. And in many cases, it will. And there isn't a whole lot of verification system on YouTube, which is again both a strength and a weakness. It is a strength because it allows you access to unfiltered information that you will not see on major news networks. And it's also a weakness because, well, it could be bullshit. And I think the potential of having access to that raw information is actually of greater value than the potential of having it be bullshit as well. As I like to believe that you can only outright lie to people for so long until they start smelling that something's up. Perhaps I'm naive, I mean the mainstream media has just been going long enough on that idea, but still. And that's the key thing too. It's not like this is anything necessarily new either. The mainstream media has been peddling lies and partisan politics for quite some time too. The big picture, when we speak around the country, we often tell audiences that when you're sitting at the table, people of different ages and politics, several of them probably get their information on platforms you've never visited, from popular influencers you've never heard of, on topics that might seem exotic or totally new. Big traditional media still has its moments, presidential debates, town halls, and sit-down interviews, but even then, most of the narrative shaping is done on quick Twitch video bites or reinterpretation on podcast search platforms or YouTube. Again, yeah. Because let's take a presidential debate, right? A presidential debate is in essence, what it should be is a moderator going, here's the topic, passing it on to the candidates, and the candidates then talk upon it. There is no interpretation there, or at least there shouldn't be if it is a proper presidential debate. So if you're going to want a point of view on it, well, you're going to have to look for YouTubers, or wait until the debate is over, and then you hear a bunch of dudes in suits give you their point of view as well. A point of view of a bunch of people earning a few $100,000 a year. And that's also the big divide there. Top executives and officials tell us that reaching people ages 35 and under with any message or even major events is almost impossible, or they've seen an 8-second clip with no context, so they have a very different understanding of what happened than someone who saw a mainstream report. There are TV cord cutters living in fractured communities on Instagram, TikTok, and streaming audio. And again, I want you to note here the highly negative spin they place on all of this. They present it as if the mainstream media was a source of truth, of context, and reality, whereas all of this other, that could be misinformation out the wazoo. And again, it can be, but I'd like to remind you that some of the headlines that was around right when Donald Trump was shot was, I will never forget CNN's headline, Trump stumbles at rally. You accuse YouTubers of spreading misinformation, and sure, I'm sure they do on occasion, but Trump stumbles at rally with a picture of him bleeding from the side of his face. Again, there is a reason why people don't trust the mainstream media, and it isn't just because other people lie too. Ben Laporte, White House Communication Director and Senior Advisor, told us whether you're president or CEO, when you reach the network evening news, you're only hitting a total of 20 million Americans. And we've increasingly found that Americans under 35 and under aren't consuming news from traditional outlets at all. Video platforms, influencer engagement, and streaming of all forms, especially podcasts, must be part of your media mix to reach a younger, diverse, persuadable demographic. Well, persuadable demographic. Now, there's the question I do question, though. That's a big issue. Is it truly a persuadable demographic? I am not necessarily convinced of that at all. I think, in fact, that by doing this, by shopping around for the appropriate podcast, you're actually creating an even more insular and pocketed sort of reality. Now, that was the benefit of large-scale mainstream news, when basically everyone drew their information from the same source. At the very least, you were relatively certain of a somewhat coherent worldview, until the left arrived and started renaming words, that is. But now, if you've got 500 different sources of information rather than 5, again, the benefit is that you get different points of view, and the disadvantage is that some of them might just be blatantly misleading or incorrect. Harris is focused on traditional media more than Trump does, but her staff is equally focused on chopping her appearance into small clips. When she sat down with 60 Minutes, her comments about owning a Glock, quickly clipped and posted by a campaign, soon had 1 million views on TikTok. Just like the opposition also, of course, clipped certain other less favorable responses, like when she was asked when she noticed that Joe Biden wasn't all with it. The shift, partially a reaction to plummeting trust in traditional media, partially the reality of younger people gobbling up news info on new platforms, has reordered the information ecosystem at an epic scale. Again, Axios Media here, who made this article, are kind of just catching up to this now, but this happened 10 years plus ago. Axios Media Trends author Sarah Fisher, who tracks the business of media better than anyone, walked through but a few recent examples of the New World Order. Harris targeted undecided Latinos on Nueva Network with Stephanie, I'm not even going to try, for a radio interview last month. Nueva is the largest independently owned Spanish-language audio network in the US. Harris reached young black men on NBA-focused All the Smoke podcast hosted by Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson. She aimed for younger black women on The Shade Room, an online culture brand that reaches primarily young black people. Harris taped an interview last Thursday in Georgia with former NFL player Shannon Sharp for podcast Club Shay Shay. And again, this is exactly what I talked about, isn't it? It is the bubbling off and then the targeting of these groups in specific, both the wider group in total, and then the smaller isolated areas. So you now have a campaign that targeted specifically like Latino women, or black men, or Latino they-thems, etc. And these will now all start getting their own, like, isolated bubble-esque point of views on politics. Trump's long-form interviews put a premium on young conservatives, libertarians, or agnostic men. He appeared in a live stream with a controversial streamer Aiden Ross, hosted on the niche live streaming video platform Kick, which is known for looser moderation than a rival like Twitch. At its peak, it had over 580,000 viewers, which is insane, in particular on Kick. And of course, the Joe Rogan podcast was even bigger. What's next? TV is dying, slowly but surely. The audience for TV is all than shrinking. There's even changing where the canons spend their TV budgets. Political ads used to be all the local broadcasts, essentially. Now it's CTV, connected TV, and streaming and digital. And there's also another thing there. The cost as well. Primetime television slots are not cheap. They are not cheap at all. They cost a hell of a lot of money. And if you wish it to run continuously and often enough to be viewed by a large enough number of people, you need to hit tons of these ads. And advertisement is in essence a big numbers game where you need to put your message in front of millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people so that the 1% who give a shit will actually see the message that you are putting out there. Whereas on a podcast, well, people are already actively tuning in to the podcast. They're already deliberately sitting down to engage with the topic at hand. It is a vastly more effective way of targeting people and have them wish to be targeted. Threat level. When attention is scattered across scores of charts, it is easier to propagate conspiracy theories and manipulate news. It's way hard to catch Russian misinformation campaigns when they're unleashed inside a dozen different information bubbles. Well, that's the thing. Russian misinformation campaigns. See, again, this is very clearly so the mainstream media view on it. You have the PES dossier, for example. You've had mainstream media, a news outlet, run blatantly false thing and do so for years. The Very Fine People hoax, for example, was recently repeated in the latest presidential debate again. That has been alive for what? 6-8 years now? The media is no better. Like, this is literally the question of the poisoning the well again, right? If you have 5 wells, then we have a fairly unified picture of the world with view of the world, right? Okay, cool, that's great. But if those 5 if 4 of those 5 wells are poisoned, well, now the majority of people will have poison in their water. If you have 5,000 wells and 4,000 of them are poison, there is still a substantially larger amount of wells you can drink from that are safe. A bit of a tortured analogy, but you get my general drift. And in reality, the actual genuine misinformation is a fairly small portion of all this, because again, I'd like to believe that if people are being outwardly obviously lied to, they'll eventually start tuning out. It also makes it hard to operate a divided and diffused population on shared facts or truths. And there's the thing too, like, shared facts or truth. You know, the more and more I'm thinking about this, the bottom line I'm thinking is that there aren't actually that many shared facts or truths. There aren't actually that many things that are truly uncontroversial. I think in large part we thought that was the case because we weren't hearing opposing viewpoints. But having seen the politics of the left, for example, with crazy out there ideas that would not fly in any sort of normalcy, I am wondering just how unified we ever were, and perhaps it might be better to instead try to embrace the fact that we are divided and make use of it instead of trying to do this, the political talking point of now we have to come together. It's always said to come together with their idea. It is never used as an argument for joining the opposition. It is always used as an argument for other people to get in line behind you. That's how it's always used. America's new challenge: can a land of 50 different states thrive in 50 different info ecosystems and realities? Probably, yes. Would it be challenging? Probably too. And Jeffrey Katzenberg, the legendary Hollywood executive who's a co-chair of Harris' campaign, advocated for a heavy use of non-traditional outlet. You gotta fish where the fish are, he told us. They're not on cable and they're not on broadcast, they're not watching and not listening. But Katzenberg said legacy news organizations still set a major national narratives that then filter out to the masses through fractured information bubbles. That is also true. As they basically say here, what the mainstream media is now doing is not actually setting the narrative itself. Instead, it is presenting a larger picture, and then that is broken into these smaller pieces, as they use here with the metaphor of the broken glass. And that is largely correct, as you will then have many different interpretations on the same issue, and, God willing, the best ones will rise to the top and the worst ones will simply sink into mediocrity, particularly considering the fact that the overwhelming majority of social media influencers never get past even 1,000 followers. That honestly also seems rather reasonable. I mean, it seems like we are simply making information into a question of survival of the fittest. And hopefully then we will also get the most fit information out of it. Now, the reality is that this experiment has not gone on for long enough to say anything, definitive on this. Perhaps that's how it'll work out. Perhaps misinformation will spread more easily due to people's interest in finding narratives and stories that conform to their own biases, as people do tend to naturally gravitate towards circles of their own opinions and their own people. I mean, we've seen this on every level of human society pretty much, from balkanization to thought groups to ever smaller, more isolated bubbles on social media where people form groups with like-minded people, and we can also see that people tend to avoid news that disagree with them as well, which has then eventually also led to our rather fractured sense of reality today. It's an interesting situation we find ourselves in, and it is going to evolve a lot more before we really can come to any solid conclusions, even though, of course, the mainstream media has already come to theirs. Theirs is that these are shards of glass, that they should be the ones to set the narrative because they are the most fit to do so. Meanwhile, I, and many others, vehemently disagree and argue instead that these people have long since squandered their right to gatekeep information due to having misused that privilege too often in the past to push their own opinions. And honestly, as far as I'm concerned, if it weren't for the fact that many of these platforms, YouTube in particular, will artificially advantage legacy media by giving them advantageous access to the algorithm or allow them to operate independently of the YouTube's terms of service, as we saw, for example, during COVID. Independent commentators were banned from talking about COVID. They weren't allowed to speak on it. There needed to be official, trusted sources, which was the mainstream media. And the mainstream media, well, they got a lot of shit about that wrong as well, but we never really think about that. We don't talk about it. YouTube certainly doesn't mention it. The fact that the mainstream media probably spread as many, if not more, lies about the disease than the YouTubers did is completely forgotten about. So long as they are authoritative, then nothing else matters. And if it weren't for this already artificial buoying up of the mainstream media, I think we'd already start seeing their decline. Whereas now they are being at least temporarily buoyed up by access to the social media platforms, which will last at least for a while longer until their audience, in essence, ages out. Anyways, a long-winded talk there, as this is a rather interesting little topic we've got here, honestly. I would love to hear what you think about it as well, and whether or not you watch and or trust any mainstream media, and vice versa, if you watch and trust alternative influencers. Now, granted, I imagine my audience is not going to be the most neutral on that particular point, but nevertheless, it'd be interesting to hear from you on it. So, until next time, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.